Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine, just for a second, you wanted to influence how someone acts. Make them think or feel a certain way. But here's the catch. No touching, no threats. And maybe you don't even want them to realize you're doing it.
Right.
If you had to pick some tools for that, some subtle ways to shape choices, what would they be?
That's a really interesting way to frame it, isn't it? Because, yeah, we tend to think of control as, like, very direct orders, maybe force.
Yeah, exactly.
But honestly, the most powerful kinds of influence, the ones really shaping society, are often much quieter. They're sort of woven into the systems around us, the social dynamics we barely notice.
That's precisely it. And that idea is really the heart of our deep dive today. We're looking at these hidden systems that guide how we act, what we think, how we feel, often when we're completely sure, that we're making our own free choices.
And we've pulled together some fascinating sources for this. We've got classic social psychology studies, the kind that really show how easily we can be swayed, and also some big sociological ideas about how things like, bureaucracy and even being watched can steer us.
So our mission for the next little while is to unpack these tools: peer pressure, authority, those big rule systems, surveillance, even drive for, ultimate efficiency.
Yeah, see how they actually work.
Exactly. How they show up in everyday life, whether you're, dealing with stuff on campus, starting a job, or just scrolling your feed. So let's jump in. Where should we start?
Let's start with something we probably all feel almost daily. That pressure to just go along with the crowd.
Conformity.
Conformity, right. You see everyone suddenly wearing the same style of jacket on campus.
Oh, right.
Or your whole friend group starts using some new phrase, and you feel this little nudge to use it too, even if it feels kind of forced.
Precisely. And to really get under the skin of this, we need to look at Solomon Asch's work back in the 1950s. He did these incredible experiments.
Oh, yeah. He wanted to see just how powerful group pressure could be. Could it actually make someone doubt what they were seeing with their own eyes, even when the answer was totally obvious?
Okay, I think I know this one. This is the line test, right?
That's the one.
You bring someone in, tell them it's a vision test, show them 2 cards. One have a line, the other has 3 lines, and one of those 3 clearly matches the first card. Simple.
Super simple setup. But the trick was the other people in the room weren't real subjects. They were working with Asch.
Confederates.
Exactly. And on certain trials, after a few easy ones where everyone gave the right answer, these Confederates would all start giving the same, obviously wrong answer.
Yeah. Okay, so you're the real participant. You're sitting there. You know which line matches. It's crystal clear.
Right.
But the person next to you says the wrong one. Then the next person says the wrong one. Suddenly, everyone in the room agrees on something that's just false. And now it's your turn.
And what Asch found was pretty stunning. A really significant chunk of the actual subject just yielded. They went with the group's wrong answer.
Even though they knew it was wrong.
Well, that varied. But overall, about a third of the responses given by the real subjects were the incorrect conforming answer when the majority was unanimous. They ignored the evidence right in front of them.
That's wild. Just the pressure to fit in, to not be the odd one out, could literally change what you say you see.
It shows you the sheer power of that social pressure. Asch talked to people afterwards and found different reasons. Some genuinely started to doubt themselves, like, maybe I'm seeing it wrong if everyone else sees it differently. Others knew the group was wrong, but they conformed anyway. They just didn't want to be singled out or look foolish. The social awkwardness felt worse than being wrong.
So it wasn't always about belief. Sometimes it was just about public behavior, avoiding conflict.
Exactly right. And here's a really interesting tweak Asch made, something super important. He tried adding just one other person to the group who also gave the correct answer.
A partner.
A true partner, he called it. And when that happened, conformity just plummeted, dropped dramatically.
Okay. So you don't need a whole crowd agreeing with you. Just one other person makes a huge difference.
It's massive. It suggests the key thing isn't being alone versus being in a group. It's being alone against the group versus having even minimal support. That little bit of validation gives you the strength, maybe, to trust your own judgment. You see this all the time, right?
Yeah.
Being the first to speak up in class is hard, but if someone else raises their hand too,
it gets easier.
Yeah.
Or breaking some unspoken rule in your friend group, much easier if someone does it with you.
For sure.
Okay, so that's peer pressure. But what happens when the pressure isn't from peers, but from someone who seems like they're in charge, someone with authority?
Right, that takes us naturally into obedience. And for this, we have to talk about Stanley Milgram's studies from the 1960s. Infamous studies.
Yeah, these are the ones that, well, they tend to make people uncomfortable. And for good reason.
Definitely.
Milgram was really wrestling with big questions, especially after World War II. How could seemingly ordinary people get involved in terrible things? He wanted to study what he called destructive obedience.
Yeah.
How far would regular folks go just following orders from an authority figure, even if those orders seemed harmful?
So Milgram set up this experiment. He recruited ordinary men from the community, told them it was a study about learning and memory.
Right.
When they arrived, there was another person there, actually an actor, a Confederate, and through a rigged draw, the real subject always ended up as the teacher and the actor as the learner.
Okay, so it's already a bit of a setup. The teacher sits in front of this machine, right? Looks like a serious shock generator.
Yeah, very official looking. Switches labeled from 15 volts up to 450 volts. And the labels got more intense too, like slight shock, strong shock, all the way to danger, severe shock, and then just XXX.
Chilling. And the learner, the actor, is supposedly strapped into a chair in another room, hooked up to this machine.
That's the scenario. The teacher's job is to read word pairs. And if the learner gets one wrong, the teacher has to give them an electric shock.
And crucially,
they had to increase the shock level by 1 step for every single mistake.
okay. But the learner isn't actually getting shocked.
No, of course not. The actor just followed a script. At lower levels, maybe a grunt, then cries of pain, louder protests, around 300 volts, pounding on the wall.
And then?
After 315 volts, complete silence, implying maybe they passed out, or worse.
And what if the teacher hesitated, said, I don't want to do this?
That's where the authority figure came in the experimenter, usually a guy in a gray lab coat looking stern and official.
Right.
If the teacher balked, the experimenter used a sequence of standardized prods, things like, please continue, or the experiment requires that you continue. Then it is absolutely essential that you continue. And the final one, you have no other choice, you must go on.
You have no other choice. Wow. And the results.
The results shock everyone. Psychologists, psychiatrists, the general public. They all predicted most people would stop very early on once the learner showed distress.
But they didn't.
No. In the first main version of the experiment, an astonishing 65%, nearly 2/3 of the subjects, went all the way. They administered the maximum 450-volt shock, even after the learner had fallen silent.
65%.
Oh.
Ordinary people, believing they were causing intense pain, maybe even death, just because someone in a lab coat told them to keep going?
It's deeply disturbing, and it wasn't like they enjoyed it. Milgram meticulously documented their stress, sweating, trembling, stuttering, nervous laughter fits. Some even had seizures. They were clearly in agony themselves.
But they kept obeying.
They kept obeying.
So why? What made them do it? It wasn't sadism, clearly.
Milgram pointed to several factors. The setting itself mattered. Conducting it at Yale University gave it legitimacy.
Authority of the institution.
Right. Subjects felt they'd volunteered for something important, a scientific study. The shocks increased gradually, so each step felt like only a small increase from the last one, the slippery slope idea. And maybe most importantly, they felt the experimenter was responsible. The authority figure took the burden off their shoulders. They could tell themselves, I was just following orders.
That diffusion of responsibility, it's a powerful idea. And you see echoes of that everywhere, don't you?
Absolutely.
Following a boss's instructions, even if they feel wrong. Sticking to classroom rules rigidly. Doing things because that's the policy, even if it feels inhumane.
It really forces you to think about conscience versus the power of the situation, the power of authority.
Okay, so we've seen pressure from peers, pressure from authority. Let's zoom out a bit now.
Yeah.
What about the influence of just big impersonal systems, rules, procedures?
Yeah, that's a great transition. It brings us into the world of sociology and specifically Max Weber's ideas about rational organizations, about bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy. It's a word people usually use negatively, like too much red tape. But Weber saw it differently, didn't he? At least initially.
He did. He saw bureaucracy as sort of the ultimate form of rational organization for modern society. Think governments, big companies, universities, they're often structured as bureaucracies.
And how did he define it? What makes something a bureaucracy?
Well, Weber highlighted key features. A clear hierarchy, everyone knows who's above and below them. A reliance on written rules and procedures for everything. Officials are usually full-time, salaried, and hired based on qualifications, not who they know. For Weber, this was all about efficiency and predictability. Using impersonal rules was the most rational way to organize things on a large scale.
Impersonal. That sounds efficient, but maybe also cold, like those faceless bureaucrats people complain about.
Exactly. Weber himself worried about this. He talked about the iron cage of rationality, this idea that these super efficient rule-based systems could trap us, become dehumanizing.
Right.
And his student, Robert Michaels, talked about the iron law of oligarchy, how even democratic organizations tend to end up with power concentrated in the hands of a few leaders at the top.
So how does this structure, this bureaucracy, actually shape our behavior day to day?
It's all about the rules. In a bureaucracy, you're expected to follow the procedures. Regardless of your personal feelings, regardless of the specific situation, the rule is the rule. And this can lead to that feeling you mentioned earlier, a kind of diffusion of responsibility. If something goes wrong or if a rule leads to a bad outcome, the individual can say, well, I was just following protocol.
It wasn't my decision. It's just the policy.
Precisely. You hit that wall of red tape or you get the computer says no response. The system itself becomes the authority, sometimes overriding common sense or compassion.
You definitely feel this at university sometimes, right? Registering for classes, dealing with admin offices, financial aid.
Yeah, or following really strict procedures at a part-time job.
Yeah.
Your behavior isn't shaped by a direct order from a person in that moment, but by the weight of the system's rules. Compliance with procedure becomes the main goal.
Okay. Group pressure, authority figures, impersonal rules. What about just the feeling of being watched? Does that change how we act?
Absolutely. And this brings us to surveillance and control. The key ideas here come from Jeremy Bentham's concept of the panopticon and later thinkers like Michel Foucault, who analyzed its implications.
The panopticon. That was a prison design, wasn't it? From a long time ago.
Yeah, late 18th century. Bentham designed this circular prison. Cells are arranged around a central observation tower.
Okay.
The really clever or maybe terrifying part was the design meant the guard in the tower could potentially see into any cell at any time. But because of how the tower was lit or shuttered, the prisoners could never know if they were being watched at that specific moment.
So you always might be under observation, and constant potential visibility.
Exactly. And that's where Foucault picked up the idea. He argued the real power wasn't just the act of watching. It was the structure itself, the architecture that made surveillance possible at any instant. What happens, Foucault said, is that the person internalizes that possibility. You start acting as if you are always being watched, even if the tower is empty. You start regulating your own behavior.
You become your own guard, in a way. Self-policing.
That's a great way to put it. The structure itself enforces compliance without needing someone constantly looking over your shoulder. Foucault talked about the supervising of the activities to ensure compliant behavior, but the key is that internalization. The gaze gets inside your head.
And this idea feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it? Way beyond prisons.
Oh, completely. Think about CCTV cameras everywhere, streets, shops, campuses, workplaces.
Right.
Think about digital tracking employers monitoring keystrokes, websites tracking clicks, those phone calls where they say this call may be recorded for quality purposes.
It's not always that someone is watching. It's the possibility that they could be that changes things.
It subtly shapes what we do, what we say. Maybe you're a bit more careful online if you think your employer might see. Maybe you act more professionally at work knowing cameras are there.
Yeah.
And we often just accept it, right? We call it being professional or efficient or just part of the company culture. But it's a form of control based on that possibility of being seen.
It's a really powerful, quiet way to get people to conform. Just build the possibility of surveillance into the environment.
And this ties into another big concept, how these principles of rationalization and control have spread even further, something sociologist George Ritzer called McDonaldization.
Donaldization. So like the fast food model applied to everything.
Pretty much, yeah. Ritzer looked at McDonald's and saw these core principles that made it incredibly successful. Efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control through technology.
Okay.
And he argued these same principles are taking over more and more parts of life. Education, healthcare, travel, even dating sometimes.
Now let's break those down. Efficiency.
Efficiency is just finding the fastest, most streamlined way to get from point A to point B. In fast food, it's the assembly line, the drive-through, get food fast. Elsewhere, think self-checkout kiosks, Standardized online course modules you click through quickly, maybe package tours where everything is scheduled. Minimize time, minimize deviation.
Predictability.
That's about making sure everything is the same everywhere, every time. A Big Mac in Boston is the same as a Big Mac in Boise.
Right. No surprises.
Exactly. Chain stores look the same, menus are identical, customer service agents follow scripts. It removes uncertainty, which can be comforting, but also maybe boring.
Calculability. That sounds like math.
It's about focusing on things you can count, on quantity over quality. How big is the burger? How fast was the service? How many sales were made? In college, maybe it's focusing too much on grades or credit hours instead of actual learning. For professors, maybe it's counting publications instead of impact. Numbers become the measure of success, even if they miss the point.
And substitution of non-human technology.
That's replacing people with machines or systems whenever possible. Robots on assembly lines, automated phone menus instead of receptionists, online forums instead of conversations. Because machines are predictable, they don't have bad days, they don't ask for raises, they follow the rules perfectly. It enhances control and efficiency from the system's point of view. It removes the messy human element.
And the last one, control.
Control ties it all together. It's about controlling employees through strict procedures, scripts, surveillance. It's about controlling customers through limited options, guiding them through spaces physically, like how a store layout makes you walk a certain path. The goal is to make the whole process, employees and customers included, as predictable and manageable as possible. Humans are often seen as the main source of uncertainty or error.
So McDonaldization sounds like this relentless drive for rational efficiency. But Ritzer also talks about the irrationality of rationality. How can something rational be irrational?
It seems like a paradox, right? But what he means is that these systems, designed for perfect rationality and efficiency, can actually create outcomes that are doubly irrational or negative from a human perspective.
Like what?
Think about that bureaucratic red tape we mentioned. It's born from rational rules, but it can lead to absurdly inefficient or frustrating results.
Right.
Think about schools focusing so much on standardized test calculability that real creative learning suffers. Or customer service jobs where employees sound like robots because they have zero flexibility of control. The system works efficiently, but the human experience is diminished.
It's when the focus on the numbers, the rules, the speed makes you feel like you don't matter. Or when the system is so rigid it can't handle anything slightly unusual, even if common sense says it should.
Exactly. That's the irrationality. McDonaldization shows how these seemingly neutral principles, efficiency, predictability, spread through society and shape our behavior, pushing us to conform to the system's logic, sometimes at the cost of meaning, spontaneity, or just basic humanity.
Wow. Okay, so looking back at all this, conformity from peers, obedience to authority, the invisible hand of bureaucracy, the feeling of being watched, this relentless McDonaldization. They're not really separate things, are they?
Yeah. No, they're deeply intertwined. They reinforce each other. Bureaucracies use surveillance. McDonaldized systems rely on conformity and obedience from workers. Authority figures often operate within bureaucratic structures.
And together, they form this web of influence, often subtle, often invisible, that shapes so much of what we do every day. If you wanted to control people without them knowing, like we said at the start,
these are your tools. You'd build environments that maximize peer pressure, establish clear authority, use impersonal rules to diffuse responsibility, make people feel watched, and structure everything for maximum efficiency and control.
it really makes you stop and think about your own life, doesn't it? Where do you see these forces? Where have you maybe gone along with something you didn't fully agree with? Was it the group pressure? Was it an instruction from a professor, a boss, a coach? Was it just easier to follow the rules even if they seem silly? Or did you maybe act differently because you thought someone might be watching, online or offline?
Why do we conform so readily sometimes? When does obedience feel easier than resistance? What happens when the system's logic clashes with our own values? Just recognizing these forces is a huge first step.
Yeah. This deep dive, looking at these sources, it really feels like pulling back a curtain on how power actually works in subtle ways all around us, ways we might not normally notice.
Absolutely. And maybe as you go through your week now in class, at work, hanging out with friends, scrolling online, keep these ideas in mind. Ask yourself that question. Who do you obey? Why? And maybe most importantly, when do you choose not to?